Welcome to the Fear and Greed Daily Interview. I'm Sean Aylmer. There is so much disruption in the global economy at the moment, thanks to US trade policy, wars in the Middle East and Europe, and uncertainty around Chinese ambitions, among others, that it's easy to lose sight of other business risks. One such risk is corruption, or as our guest today puts it, the C in ESG. Maurice Burke is the Managing Director, Investigations, Diligence and Compliance at Kroll, K-R-O-L-L, a strategic consultancy focusing in part on enterprise risk. He argues corruption is becoming a growing problem for global businesses. Maurice, welcome to Fear and Greed.
Thank you, Sean.
Generally, broadly, is corruption more of a problem now than it has been previously?
So I think the short answer is no. In that I think, I would say it's always been a problem, and that in sort of relative terms, it's not that corruption per se is growing as a problem in the global economy. But I think it is interesting when we talk about regulatory risk and compliance pressures that businesses face, as to whether it's somewhat taking a backseat in terms of where businesses are parking their compliance resources. And it's also interesting to answer your question by reference to, is this a problem in Australia? Is it a domestic issue for Australian businesses? And I think that the honest answer again is no, that's not a growing issue. Corruption is an everyday reality, and Australia is not corruption free. But, the real problem kicks in when Australian businesses go offshore into jurisdictions where corruption is far more of an everyday reality and a threat. And that's when Australian businesses tend to trip up when they're in these high-risk environments.
Okay, so let's then get a definition of corruption, and then we might look at a few, and certainly the mining companies at different times. There's stories about what's happening when they're in different jurisdictions. But what is corruption?
So look, essentially it's providing some kind of benefit to a government official or a counterparty, on a sort of confidential basis to gain some sort of advantage, right? I mean, that's a kind of watered down version of most regulatory definitions of corruption. So it's paying a government official to issue a license to you. It's paying a significant amount of money to a company that's put out a tender for a construction project. It's paying a small amount of money to a customs official to allow your goods to come through. They're the sort of traditional examples, if you like.
Yeah.
But, corruption gets much more insidious. And then maybe this is, where risk grows, particularly for Australian companies operating offshore. We see corruption happening in circumstances where garments, clothes are being made in factories in South Asia, and bribes are being paid to factory inspectors to turn a blind eye to, human slavery issues, underage workers and terrible working conditions. That's the hidden C in an ESG issue. So that's corruption that's threatening human lives, but feeding through to the consumption of a product like garments in Australia. I did an investigation in South Asia where a factory manufacturing electronics goods couldn't understand why there was such a high risk of serious fatalities and injuries in the workplace. And they again and again checked their equipment to discover that it was all in perfectly good order until they realized that the Human Resources Department were taking bribes to hire people who were illiterate, despite the requirement for a certain degree of literacy. And so these people couldn't read any of the safety warnings on equipment. So that's corruption, endangering lives and causing problems. And again, when you talk about insidious corruption, if you're paying, government regulatory bodies in the construction space to ignore the quality of construction, you're putting economies in jeopardy, you're putting people in jeopardy, and a lot of money is lost when buildings are built badly.
Okay, so, I mean, the cost of this then is as bad as human life, literally.
It can be, and this is why we, engaging very closely with clients who, it's simplistic to say have been distracted by the E and the S in ESG, because these are important things. Saving the planet and protecting people are critical objectives as well. But we have a lot of businesses who have said, right, well, let's focus on our environmental footprint and ensuring that we're not damaging the environment in the places where we operate. Let's look at modern slavery. Let's make sure that all our workers are looked after. And businesses have finite compliance resources, and that often we see that businesses are distracting their compliance people away from, a traditional pursuit of corruption and looking at fraud, and are now worried about these issues. And that's causing something of a vacuum, if you like, where corruption issues are on the rise.
Stay with him, Maurice. We'll be back in a moment. I'm speaking to Maurice Burke from Kroll. Before the break, you said that corruption's on the rise in some area. I presume you're talking about in some, is it geographies? Is it sectors? Where is it that we've really got to keep an eye out for?
So as global business gets more complex, opportunities for corruption grow. I've been looking at, for example, Southeast Asian corruption issues in countries like Indonesia and Vietnam, who are both fighting corruption. But, there was a time when senior local officials would say, look, in the old days, corruption was pretty simple. You just paid a bribe to the central government. Now it's more complicated. We have different ministries. We have different regulators. Exactly who should get paid is not always immediately apparent. So that side has got more complicated. But economies grow. Looking at Indonesia or Vietnam, these are fantastically prosperous economies. The bigger an economy grows, the more opportunity there is for fraud and corruption.
Does the Australian governments and regulators do enough around this area?
So certainly domestically, we are lucky. Australia's standing has, and there are various sort of scores that you can reference. Often you have to be a little bit cautious about how they're ranking countries in terms of corruption risk. But Australia has essentially always stayed within the top 10 globally of sort of low risk environments for corruption purposes. And you have to credit a good corporate culture. You have to credit law enforcement. You have to look at the efforts onshore that have kept Australia in that environment. But you go straight to, there's an organization called Transparency International who create a corruption perception index. And this is the best metric out there to judge, objective corruption. And you go from number 10, which is roughly where Australia is, to, I think, number 50 or something when it comes to India, and then 88 is Vietnam, and 99. Out of 180 countries, Indonesia is considered pretty much almost outside the top 100. So these are high risk environments. So is Australia doing enough to protect Australian businesses operating in these markets? It's certainly created a regulatory framework which is designed to do that. But you can, and it's I don't need to describe the obvious challenges of policing corruption in Southeast Asian nations from an Australian perspective. It would just be an extraordinary strain on resources, even if it was possible.
You haven't mentioned cyber yet. Now, I know the 2025 Global Business Sentiment Survey from Kroll talks to 1,200 senior business leaders across a bunch of countries. Cyber comes up as a key fear. Is that about corruption, or is that something different?
No, that's about theft. That's just about fraud. The complexity, cyber. It's our other favorite topic at the moment. Is the world about to fold in on itself as a result of cyber risk and fraud? And the answer is really no. But cyber just creates the opportunity for bad actors to create fraudulent activities faster, bigger, and better, and are able to sort of, find ways to get around protections that companies have historically created. Is cyber the end of the planet as we understand it? We don't think so. There was a lot of rumbles if you start to look back a couple of decades when online banking became a reality. And it was a long time before law enforcement and compliance systems caught up with the risk that online banking created. We all thought the world was going to fold in on itself at Y2K. None of these risks are actually new. It's just the traditional chase between the bad guys finding faster, better, quicker tools to try and steal, and law enforcement and corporate compliance playing catch up. And I think that's what we're seeing in the cyberspace. And
we are out of time, but I can't let you go without at least mentioning AI, artificial intelligence, and how that fits in to this process. The scary stories are about AI doing all sorts of things that are corrupt and we don't want to know about. But I mean, is that the reality?
So AI is I'll give you a short answer to an extremely complicated question, but often clients come and say, how are we going to fight AI? How are we possibly going to cope with this? And a lot of the time the answer is AI. It's not just a tool that the bad guys can deploy. The best compliance systems we see now, which are, tracking aberrant patterns of behavior or anomalous kind of financial movements, are AI driven. So the trick is to get in and embrace AI as an effective compliance tool and do all of the bits and pieces associated with that, which is good training, good integration, constantly monitoring the AI to make sure that it's doing what it's supposed to be doing. But, it's a better compliance tool than it is, a weapon for fraudsters. So, the short answer is, if you're worried about AI, get a good AI consultant.
Maurice, thanks for talking to Fear and Greed.
Thank you. I was going to add, by the way, just to summarize, I love the name of this podcast, but and I was having a giggle because it seems that when you're talking about corruption, the problem with corruption is there's too much greed and not enough fear.
Very appropriate. Well, it's called Fear and Greed because markets, of course, are driven by fear and greed. Benjamin Graham said that decades and decades ago. And maybe corruption is driven by fear and greed too then.
Well, it's driven. I definitely agree. Sometimes the best, I lived in Singapore for 23 years. The anti-corruption fight there is driven by fear, the fear of getting caught. So it's a slightly different dynamic. But thank you, Sean.
That was Maurice Burke, Managing Director, Investigations, Diligence and Compliance at Kroll. This is the Fear and Greed Business Interview. Join us every morning for the full episode of Fear and Greed, business news you can use. I'm Sean Aylmer. Enjoy your day.